In this lesson, we are going to take a look at a command called Weld Bead. We will once again use the Model Workbench Complete, which can be located in the Working Files folder. Before we get into the Weld Bead command, let's first talk about an older SOLIDWORKS command called Fillet Bead. While we only have access to the newer Weld Bead command in the Weldments ribbon, we can find both the Fillet Bead and Weld Bead in the drop-down menu Insert, Weldments, and there's both commands. Even though the commands may look similar when you first launch them, the Weld Bead command, which was introduced in SOLIDWORKS 2011, should be used over the Fillet Bead for performance purposes and the additional enhancements. If you read the various SOLIDWORKS discussion boards, it appears the Fillet Bead command is most likely still in the software for legacy support. I felt it was important to mention Fillet Bead because it wouldn't take too long before you stumbled across the command and began wondering how the two are different. We are going to place a weld bead around this table leg and attach it to the base plate. We're going to begin by selecting Weld Bead. Property Manager opens. The very first thing we need to do is create a weld path. Now we have two options for creating a weld path: selecting faces or using the Smart Weld tool. We're going to select faces. So I'm going to go out to the screen and select the various faces. And you can see the beginning of the weld path. What I'm creating here is all part of Weld Path 1. If I want a new weld path, I simply come down here, select New Weld Path. It now shows Weld Path 2. I'm going to rotate the model around, put it back in the middle of the screen. And this time, instead of selecting faces, let's try the Smart Weld tool. I'm going to select the button, and what you do is hold down the left mouse button and sketch a line across the faces, and a weld path is created. Pretty neat. It's important to note that these settings are independent for each weld path. So if I switch over to Weld Path 1, anything I change down here only affect Weld Path 1. So with Weld Path 1 selected, notice we can set the bead size. I'm going to leave it at 6 millimeters. Let's change over to Weld Path 2. We'll change this bead size to 4 millimeters. And let's take a look at some of these other settings. Let's begin with from to length. I'm going to expand the screen, put a check mark inside of the box, and I have the options of start point and weld length. Start point's at 0, and the current weld length is 85.69 millimeters. Let me type in 10 for the start point, just so we can see what happens here. The weld length updates to 75.69 millimeters, and you can see on the screen, this was the original start point. Now the weld will begin 10 millimeters away, so we have a 10 millimeter gap here. I'm going to uncheck this, and let's try intermittent weld. Put a check mark inside of the box, and we have two options: gap in weld length and pitch in weld length. I'm going to set the weld length at 6 and the gap at 3. And you see the preview on the screen. The last thing we need to do is define the weld symbol. So let's define the weld symbol for Weld Path 2. I'll click Define Weld Symbol. The ANSI weld symbol screen opens. And if you're familiar with weld symbols, this should be very familiar to you. There's my 4 millimeter weld with my intermittent weld. My weld symbol is currently at fillet. I'm going to leave it at fillet and say OK. I'm going to scroll up the Property Manager, select the Weld Path 1, define weld symbol. There's my 6 millimeter weld. With this one, let's add 6 times since we have 6 legs, and say OK. Close out of the Weld Bead command, and we see the 2 weld symbols appear on the screen. Now, if we look at the Feature Manager tree, you will see we have a new folder called Weld Folder. I'm going to expand this. Once we expand it, you see both the 6 and 4 millimeter fillet weld. I'm going to right mouse click on the 6 and select Properties. This window shows the properties for both welds of both the 6 and the 4. Now this is very important to understand. Weld beads are displayed as graphical representations only, similar to cosmetic threads. Weld beads are lightweight and do not affect the performance, which means no solid bodies are created as part of the weld bead command. With that said, when you calculate the overall mass of this model, the overall mass will not include the weight of the weld beads. However, in this window, they do give you a total weld mass, and for the 6mm, it's 60.57 grams. So you can take the overall mass of the model, which is going to be slightly less than the real weight of the model. However, if you add the weld mass, you're going to have a closer approximation of the real weight. I'm going to close out of this screen. I'm going to expand the 6mm fillet weld and do the same for 4. And notice I can right mouse click on Weld Bead 1, edit feature, and it takes me back to the original property manager. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. And you may have noticed we are not seeing a cosmetic weld on the screen. By default, it is not turned on. However, if you do want to see that cosmetic weld, you simply right mouse click on the weld folder and show cosmetic welds. And there you have it. Weld beads can be added to weldment parts, assemblies, and multi-body parts, and the weld bead command functions the same in all. This concludes our lesson on adding a weld bead to parts or assemblies.